days, and we're going to use a very alpha version of our online event storming tool. It's called StoryStream, and I'm just going to show that because when you have a screen, it's better than trying to do sticky notes. As you know, event storming is a technique where you get where you put basically what happens on a timeline, right? And if you look at this, this is one of those timelines. It starts to the left. There's a time arrow leading from the present to the future, and you're getting from there to the right. And there's various workflows, and it basically shows what happens as a sequence of events, right? So you have in this case, what this actually is an event storming of a bike share program we have here in the Vancouver suburbs, and courtesy of U-Bicycle, right? This was a bit of an experiment. We use event storming a lot to sort of reverse engineer, in air quotes, existing systems to understand legacy and to help plan migration strategies and so forth. So we don't just use it for event source systems or anything. It's really a sort of project management and planning tool as well. And so, victim of having done this for too long, one rainy morning when I was walking to a coffee shop, I said, it's kind of, hey, look, is that a bike share station? How about if I sign up right now on my phone, download the app, and see what it's like, the UX of actually signing up with these guys. It's pretty good. I was impressed. And while we're at it, I was using the still very alpha mobile version of StoryStream, the mobile site, to actually event storm it as I went along. And so this is part of this, right? It's a bit of a work. It's a work in progress. And in this particular one, where we start, the actual sign-up experience is really this, right? So this is me trying to register. And the blue things are, this is, if you look at Alberto Brandolini's book on event storming, we're using the original colors here. If you look at the blue things, those are commands, things users do, like register. These are events, always in past tense. The amber things here, like registration started. And the green things are documents, also known as read models. And this is basically stuff which someone sees on a screen or which is used for decision making by the system later. Like there's, let's say there's some admin can see a list of pending registrations here or something, right? So in this case, you click register on in their app, right? And you give it an email address. Whoops. You give it an email address, and then the registrations, then a registration started event happens. You can see a user ID which has been assigned here, and that user ID system assigned and the email are unknown, and that winds up in pending registrations. Next, you get an email, and you get a confirmation code. And when you click that link, the system in the back, hypothetical system, there is without a doubt something in the back in the actual system, which I'm not aware of, which does that, right? Somewhere there is something which processes a confirm registration command, no matter what architecture that is, no matter what you're looking at in terms of stack or implementation, or is it legacy, or is it a modern microservices event source CQRS system, doesn't matter. Something in there does that, confirm registration, right? Then so the registration confirmed, assuming it's okay. And then it has the user ID, so you can relate that back. And then there is another table, document, screen, whatever, right? Where we can see confirmed registrations. So a log of everything that's been confirmed, maybe for support, whatever. And then the next thing in the app, U-Bicycle app, is once you confirm, only after you confirm your registration, does it ask you to specify a password for logging in, right? And so you get set password with a clear text password, and the event is stored with a password hash in this sort of reverse engineered U-Bicycle registration flow. And finally, after that, you add a payment method. There's other stuff which I omitted here where you have to, it has to process a deposit and so on. We can add that in a moment. And you add your payment method, and that's payment method added event with the token you need, and last 4 digits. And finally, there's now you can look at your profile, user profile, as your email, and you can't see the credit card token, but it's used for something else. A bit from a design perspective, it probably shouldn't be there, and so forth. And then you can finally ride a bike in this simplified version. And riding a bike, these are sort of station. Basically, you don't need a docking station in this model. For example, Victoria in British Columbia is where these guys are, and so on. And these bikes are parked at predetermined locations identified by lat long. You unlock the bike, leads to bike unlocked and ride started, right? A separate event. And then also because you started that ride, there's a bike removed event which says that this bike is no longer at this location. Then at the end of it, you lock your bike again, and every bike has a latitude and longitude associated with it, right? You can tell where these things are. And so what happens is you can lock that bike, but it only, there's a query somewhere in there, right? In the locations list. We can look at how you configure locations. That's a separate workflow in a moment. And it's like bike returned. Only happens if, here's the policy for that, only mark the bike as returned if it's within 10 meters of a location. And finally, there's bike added as in this new location, the one where this, which was determined by querying whether anything is near the bike's lat long, now shows that bike as having been added to it. So that's a very still simplistic event flow for this bike sharing system. Now, of course, where these locations come from, if you look at the very first workflow called bike inventory, that stream is, imagine whenever we do an event storming for a new system, or also for reverse engineering for understanding legacy and so on, we always imagine a completely empty database, completely nothing there, blank slate at the beginning. So of course, no one can, there are no users. We just have Joe here registering, right? But also he can't really take out any bikes, which is the actual happy path beginning to end of the entire thing, is we first need to sort of configure locations. And this, of course, simplistic way of looking at it, there's create location as the first command, which some administrator is issuing. And there's a latitude and a longitude and the name, for example, I don't know, commercial Broadway SkyTrain station, whatever it may be, right? And this is, by the way, this is incorrect. This is a command. It's not shown. Let's edit that. I'll show the edit in a moment. Create location needs to be a command. Sorry about that. Your first intro to ESL, the event storming language. So create location, and it leads to location created, which of course would have all those properties and so on. You don't need to always show those in the event stormings. And then there's a locations list, and this locations list, this artifact, searchable, whatever that is, who cares, some database technology of some kind in the back, that's what's being searched later in order to see if we can have a bike returned event. Only if the bike location latitude and longitude are within 10 meters of one of the stations in here, right? The stations have latitude and longitude, and only if you lock your bike within 10 meters of one of those return stations, is it marked as a bike, only then is a bike returned event issued, right? As a result of running this command. And then of course, because you now have a location ID, you can also add the bike to it. So that in a nutshell is the beginning of an event storming for sort of designing a bike share system. Now, what the general run of things of event storming, something like that, is that you just start with the events, just randomly brainstorm them, and then put them in the right order and removing duplicates. StoryStream has a sort of a collaboration feature where you can do that collaboratively online and so forth. Then once that's done, you get once you have the events down, you look at people do it differently, but when actually doing this I don't think I've done a single project in the last 3 years without using event storming as a design tool. And before that, on various other projects on and off, right? Ever since Alberto invented that thing, just shortly after. Originally, Adam Dimitri kind of introduced me to this very valuable tool to have in your toolkit. And so once you have the events down, I find it useful to next look at those read models, right? The information people need to see at one level. I mean, this is a searchable thing, but it's also in general, in order to know what button to click on a user interface, there's certain things which people need to see on the screen. For example, if your user profile, you kind of need to see that if you want to update, in this case, credit card or whatever, right? And so usually after the events, I look at the read models needed, information needed for decision making, either by people or by command handlers. Like over here, that lock bike command handler, whether this results in a bike returned event depends on evaluating this, right? So that is the sort of the first cut. Then afterwards, you add the commands, and this is the part where you get into thinking about command parameters, event properties, and also sort of properties of those read models and documents, right? And this is a very valuable exercise to look at what parameters and properties you need, because it tells you whether, for example, it tells you whether you have at this. Always remember, this is sort of a timeline, right, from the present to the future. And when you, for example, want to unlock a bike when you want to ride, well, how do you know what bikes actually exist at that location, right? So there's certain information you need. Okay. One predecessor event for being able to do this unlocking is there has to be a location, there have to be location created and bike added events, right? And here's another bug in my prep location.
So, Robert, once you get done, maybe we just open it up to a few questions.
Sure, I will do that. And so when you have, so there's always predecessor events. For example, pending registrations requires actual registration started events for it to be populated. From that, you work backwards for information requirements on what needs to be on the screen. And that gives you insight on transactional boundaries. And it also gives you insight in UX. Adam came up with a very nice way of sort of, you imagine there's a row up there with user interface elements and things like that, and screens. So this is where UX comes in. So and with that in hand, you can then continue modeling that system. So this is how we generally do it. There's a completely separate track, how we manage projects directly from events. And with that short intro, just open it up for questions here. That's a general flow of how we've been designing things. So ask me anything, speak up, and
people, if you'd like to, you can either ask in person this way, or you can send a note, and you can send it to everyone, or you can send it directly to me, and then I can forward the question to Robert.
So I have some questions further to implementation and stuff. Do you get to that later, or can I ask stuff now? Or
Go ahead. Ask now.
So basically, if I design those events and the replies in the beginning, how does it work later in the project when the semantics of those event changes, when the properties change, when properties get obsolete? If I want to basically replay those events to synchronize state again, but old events are basically with completely different from the events that I have now in the project because they evolved so much. How do you deal with that?
Well, that depends on whether you have a, these are versioning, boils down to the topic of versioning stuff, right? And there are two basic approaches. They depend on whether you have the system you've been event storming, you're using this for, is event sourced or whether it's not event sourced, right? So if, let's say it kind of applies to non-event sourced legacy, but let's say that you do an event storming and based on this, you build a traditional, for argument's sake, relational database-based current state only system, right? Some CRUD system of some kind. And if you do that, then it depends, in a nutshell, test coverage really helps. I did a tweet yesterday. I was working on one of our systems which happens to be event-based. And I was kind of showing, I don't have it here now, but I was kind of showing what our tests look like, right? So the key to testing, to making sure that you don't get side effects, one key is to have good test coverage. Whenever you have a system which is based on a command, if it changes state, an event happens, and then read models, whoever subscribes to that get updated. A pattern for testing emerges where you can basically issue the command, check if that event results, and then query some mocked up read models and other things for the result, right? So that's one way. Basically, you would you make your change, which would require a new version. You see what tests break and you fix them. That's the same general pattern whether you go event sourced or not. And then in the non-event sourced one, you do the usual thing. You do your database update scripts and versioning and all this other stuff, which is extremely painful at scale, right? So it's truly evil. And in an event sourced system, you have better options, right? You can basically understand better what needs to be consistent. Replaying all the events is one of them. Greg Young wrote an entire book on this topic. Greg Young's book on event versioning and how to handle event streams, highly recommended. It's basically that's it right there, right? What he describes various options. I'm going to touch very briefly on a couple. The first one is you don't actually write a new event stream, but you write an adapter which maps. First of all, it's not a good idea to ever delete those properties. It's best, if you can get away with it, to have it additive only, right? And so with this, you can have, for example, let's say let's pick an example, right? Let's say that locations, in addition to a name and a latitude and longitude, also have a who knows what description, right? That's a pretty tame change, and one way the most basic way of avoiding having to do versioning to begin with is to simply make whatever read model builder is in charge of building the locations, let's call it a table, simply ignores, as in doesn't throw an error or doesn't fail or something if there's additional things, right? So that's one. Just ignore additional things. It means you avoid having to do a new version for that. The next one is, well, the meaning of something changes. That's more difficult. Let's say for a moment, let's say in an onslaught of insanity, someone decided to have latitude as the old degrees and minutes and so forth, rather than the more modern notation, which is basically a decimal, express a decimal, let's say some other data format for latitude and longitude, doesn't matter what. So what would happen then is that that read model builder for locations would break. So it means that you have, it gets a latitude, but it throws an error because it's not in the expected format anymore. And so in that scenario, you can either have, you can push new code for this, which translates between this. So it knows that old events, which are in the traditional sailing ship area, degrees, minutes, and so on thing, and it knows that there's an adapter which translates it into the new decimal format. That way you don't have to make any changes to your event stream, because the changes are in the consumers, right? Whatever consumes those events, be it whatever needs information from them needs to change. That's a problem though, because all of a sudden you don't just need to write that. It can be a problem, right? You don't just need to make code changes here. You also need to make code changes over here, where the handler for the log bike command has to understand latitude and longitude in both formats. So eventually you have all these little adapters which change, which make those changes sprinkled all over your code. So that's the trade-off. You have a bunch of adapters and other things, or you rewrite your event stream. Or the third one is you have a you have a second event, which whenever you have basically an event version 2, which has the new changes and the rest of it, but then you still have to handle that. You may have separate read models and so on. So it's a very complicated topic with many trade-offs, and it is entirely situational where you go. And I highly recommend checking out Greg's book on that. It basically, that's it on a nutshell. It gives you he has a lot of experience in that stuff, and it gives you the options and trade-offs in a nutshell. Very highly recommended for that.
Cool, thank you.
Other questions, please? Okay, so cut in here anytime. Either sort of put a message. Rob is keeping an eye on the messages, or simply cut in. Right, interrupt me here because it would be great to get some more user questions. While we're waiting for that, I'm just going to. You're seeing sort of an event storming in progress here online, and let me just show you something how in StoryStream you actually edit that stuff. Oh my God, it's code. So this is a language we evolved over the last 2 or 3 years, adapting in TwoTonic. There's a bunch of open source for that as well. And what we're looking at here is the language is called ESL. We kind of iterated on what the name should be, but we call it the event storming language. And the idea was, because we're geeks, a very simple, takes 10 minutes to learn notation for representing event storming, so they're accessible both for tooling and for really quickly event storming in a phone, right? We've started using this increasingly. This example with you're standing in the rain registering for a bike share right there and then you event storm it. Well, you simply type that on your phone. People text all the time. And also when you collaborate in a room, right, you can see this thing growing on a giant screen as people, instead of sticky notes, just use their phone. I'm not sure if you have any millennials in the crowd. I'm too old for this, but they love this stuff. And that's have a couple of things here, right? If you look at adding a payment method, we're missing something here. I also want to take a deposit, right? So here the command would be charge deposit. And a command in ESL is basically this here. You have this little arrow thing here, and if you want parameters, they're optional. You can add to that various parameters. In this case, you see other examples in other lines for this. But in this case, charge deposit can result in, of course, payment processed. And anything you type in any line by default is an event. So if you know, there's really nothing to learning the event storming language, ESL. In a nutshell, just start typing. Unless you add a little arrow, which turns it into a command, or a star, which makes it a read model. I forgot a few of those earlier, or comments. Comments are with 2 slashes. Or you create a new workflow, 3 slashes. That's the entire language, right? So the design, the major design criteria for that language, which by now we've used in probably half a dozen projects and so on. And in a lot of our Thursday night event storming sessions here in Vancouver. The primary criterion for the language was that it needs to be learnable in 10 minutes by just about anyone. And so in this case, there's payment processed, but there would also be deposit received as an event. And as a comment, let's put in deposit received only occurs, if payment processing succeeded, for example, right? So that's a comment. And of course, if you look at those workflows, right, we're clearly missing a few. For example, what happens if someone if this fails, right? Payment processing failed as an event and so on. But there's other stuff like people never return a bike and so on. And so if you need another workflow, you just add that. Here's, if you look at the bottom here, let's do another workflow, call it payment processing deposit payment failed. Is another workflow. Maybe you can generalize that into something where it applies to other things, right? And so in this one, this would be process payment. And then you have payment processing failed. And you may have some sort of report or something which says failed payments. You get the idea, right? So you kind of iterate with this stuff until you have a pretty good view of the various workflows, ways through the system, various policies and business rules, and so on. This is a very, very early alpha version of StoryStream. What you're going to see is sort of bird's eye view looks on which event happens in which workflows, and do we have all the properties. There's assorted ways of making this from a modeling perspective. There is that language, the ESL language combined with EML, which is the event modeling language, makes this kind of thing accessible to tooling, where you can use that as a sort of architect in a box with some magic to design cohesive and loosely coupled microservices. There's a bunch of open source we released for that, what we call the Lester stack. I hate the name, I'm going to change it. And I just forked that to my GitHub repo. To bring it up to date with this version of the language. There's some work happening in this to basically have design tooling which goes with this to turn it into sort of microservices design workbench. So it gives you a sense of how you event storm in this tool, and how you, more importantly, how you evolve the beginnings of an event storming and the initial ideas into something which makes a good sound basis to start building systems off, or for that matter, understand your legacy better and do onboarding and stuff like that. All right, other questions? All right.
I have a question.
Go for it, Rick.
So I see this. So you've showed us how I could use this tool, like if one person is doing it. But you know, usually in event storming, you have a couple people working together.
Yeah.
Give us a hint on where the tool is at and how we could kind of encourage that, like multiple people doing it at the same time.
Sure. Collaborative editing, you do it by copying that link, pasting it into somewhere, and then go nuts. You can edit as a team. If you wanted to share the entire event storming, and as I say, this is alpha, right? It's not far off for I'm not really prepared to let that out of the shop in a general release yet. So it's basically that, right? If you do that, it means you can collaboratively edit the whole thing, work together, copy that around, and you go.
I guess the question is, do you, like in a personal event storming, you see the other person editing, right? So you know they're working on the same section as you.
Yes, you can see that here too.
Pardon?
Yeah, you can see that here too. That's still, see that feature is that it is still not. You can do it, but I'm still. It works, right? If I would give you that link, you could literally edit this thing, and it's nice. But there's a couple of UX things which I'm not happy with yet. We tried that with a whole bunch of users and all the rest of it. But in a nutshell, it boils down to this. When you collaboratively do that, think of it as, there's various usage scenarios, right? But one of them is that you imagine a room full of people who event storm, or for that matter, everybody's on remote, doesn't matter, right? On remote, use this UI. In a room, they might use their phones, doesn't matter. But somewhere there's a shared, people look at this particular StoryStream, and if someone else would be editing this now, then you could see it change before your eyes, right? It goes to wherever somebody's editing and so on. And the idea is that you can literally see this evolve as various people edit it, right? So you're in a room, imagine a room full of people or remote, everybody edits on their phone or otherwise, and the brainstorming happens, right? There's a couple of workflow things where I'm still working on this. And that brainstorming, if you care to watch and you see what other people are doing, you can see that on the big screen or on a browser window, and it literally evolves before your eyes. And then the same thing, right? You eliminate the duplicates, you put it in order, you can follow it, and you can also separately edit it, right? So it becomes, and then of course it's there for you as an artifact. Which is there for you to share and so on. And you can also embed it, right? So if I click this share link, that link would give you basically, it would prompt you you'd register with StoryStream, and then you get this very same thing, and you can play around with it. Bit early to, I don't want to quite leave it out of the shop yet, but it's basically a collaborative tool for teams which can't meet in person very easily. This is common. We just talked with a former client yesterday about this, and basically his thing is, you know what, we do workshops, right? We have a lot of experience with this stuff, and he tells me, you know what, I can free up budget for these workshops easy enough. The value is obvious and all the rest of it, but you know what my main problem is? To get all these people in one location and free them up for all that time needed. That in itself is the biggest challenge. And with this, you can, that's part of the solution for making it more practical to regularly revisit your assumptions, to regularly keep that updated, and to kind of involve people who maybe couldn't be there at the time, right? It is by far the best if you have a room full of people working on a whiteboard and on walls with sticky notes. Nothing beats that. It's just that the reality is that you can't always do that, right? It's a considerable challenge to get busy people to take aside that time, and then importantly follow up on it, right? It's kind of, we've seen this a lot of times. You do these event stormings, people take photos on their phone, and then it's kind of languishes somewhere. There are no follow-up actions. So this is what this is intended to address once it's live. And as I say, I'm not happy with some of the UX yet, fiddling with this. I will actually give, we're going to have a Slack channel for StoryStream soon, which we'll share with all of you. And would love to hear some feedback, fool around with it, but don't be surprised if there's assorted things. I'm very interested to hear what people run into and what people would like to see. This is kind of like the softest of soft launches. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. Other questions? Okay. So in the absence of other questions, let me just again chime in here and interrupt and text something and let Robert interrupt or whatever. It's kind of, I just wanted to give a bit of a point you at something which we've been using this for. As I say, I think there's the guys of the Vancouver school who kind of use this approach, like Adaptec and us and other people and so on. And I think this is something we cooked up here. I put it out on Reddit and Twitter to see if anybody comes up who does something similar. I so far haven't heard anything. But what we do is we actually use this for project management. I wrote a blog post about that. If you look on Medium, it's basically, here's your event storming, right? And if you look, this is a food delivery service, right? Menu created, menu item added, order created, stuff like that. And what happens, what we do to manage projects with that, again, here's your command, your events, the usual stuff, your documents and so forth. And we just rotate that 90 degrees, right? If you look at this, I hope the screen is big enough. We like to use Trello, but anything will do. If you're all in a room, nothing works as well as a nice Kanban board on a wall with sticky notes. It breaks down as soon as one guy works on remote, but whatever, we use Trello, right? Not a must, anything works. Note this, we just rotate these things 90 degrees, right? Menu created, it's order created, and so on, right? And turn them into to-dos in one of those things. So what happens when you do that is you can track that. We don't add the commands. We found that they don't really add value from a project management perspective. We've done that in quite a lot of projects by now. But you basically, the idea is to get menu created is the hardest one because it's all your iteration zero stuff. That's all the DevOps, all the provisioning, all the rest of it, because it means that in that UI, a user can actually create a restaurant menu. In that API, all the validation rules and command handling happens in that data store, whatever we use. Our standard is to use Greg Young's event store, and for read models, Postgres. In some systems, we use Elasticsearch. It doesn't matter, whatever you need for your web modules. That Elasticsearch is for an IoT project with sensor reading, stuff like that, whatever you need, right? But whatever that is, it really needs to be there. It needs to be provisioned and all the rest of it. So this is very hard to do. And then you move on to the next one. So done really means done if you do it ideally, right? So there's a lot to do for getting the initial one done. And so forth. So I just wanted to sort of point you at that blog post, which goes over this way of managing projects. There is an element of applicability to this, right? So it's very, very useful for doing the initial happy path, this thing from the very beginning to the very end, which I showed you here, right? The happy path from the beginning, create an inventory, register users, all the rest of it. to get a minimum viable going, if you will. Then afterwards, we just tend to switch to a more conventional backlog for fixing bugs and other things. But as an initial tool to get end-to-end integration going as fast as possible and add value towards a minimum viable, it turned out to be very nice for managing projects. I think, I don't know about that. That's why I'm kind of throwing it out there to hear of people who might have tried something similar. From my observations, I think it's because it gives you better guide fences, right? Status reporting is trivial. Oh, we can confirm registrations, but we can't update passwords yet. Oh, perfect. Oh, nice. Okay. There's better guide fences. You can't just dream up stuff like you can in a user story map. It's nuts and bolts, things which actually have to happen. Events are the sort of organizing principle for your project plan. I think that's why it worked so well for us. But also one caveat is I've only ever tried that with purely event-sourced systems. I do not know how it would work if you use this to manage a non-event sourced system. We would have time for one question. So if somebody ask me anything here.
So Robert, if there's not, certainly if anybody has a question, please jump in. But one question I would have is, you mentioned the ESL and EML languages. What else can you do with it? Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, ESL. If you look at this, ESL is basically think of it as it's like we experimented with other stuff and the clicky draggy drawing things and so on for doing event stormings. But ESL, the event storming language, is really it makes it possible to have a digital artifact which is accessible to sort of machine reasoning, if you will. And to show, let me see if I can just go there. Hang on a sec. I forked this because I'm evolving this from something we built at Adaptec. But the language has evolved since those early ideas. But if you look at this, right, it hasn't been renamed yet, and it's a work in progress. But in a nutshell, what this does is it turns it turns ESL, the language you just saw an example for, and has command line tooling and stuff to turn it straight into an API, right? Straight up. It builds it spins up a bunch of Docker containers which run Event Store and Postgres, and it's got a Swagger UI you can fool around with and so on. Some of you who've been to our workshops in Vancouver and so forth have seen this. We actually use it to prototype APIs with clients. I have done that for a long time, but it is not at a level where it gives you a nice starting point and so on. But in a nutshell, it makes event stormings accessible to various pieces of tooling. Another thing, so there's the event modeling language, which I haven't shown an example of because it's also currently evolving. That open source thing I showed you has an early example of it. Is a way of it basically, you turn the event storming into an event model, which then allows assorted automated reasoning with warnings and so on, which boils down to, does your design make sense in a microservices way, right? Will you get the loose coupling and high cohesion if you implement? It doesn't matter what you're used to implement it in, right? The automated tooling creates an event source system because that's simplest for us, but it doesn't matter how you implement it. If you have a design, a microservice design or refactoring direction of which this event modeling artifact is the outcome, is it does it give you the necessary transactional integrity? What's the effect on coupling and cohesion and so on? So this is very early days, but there's a set of tooling evolving around all that.
Cool.
Okay, so I think we are at the slightly beyond the official end. I'm not sure who's still here. If there's any closing question or remarks, we could please go ahead. Okay, I suppose there aren't. So if you look me up on Twitter, for example, and want to follow me there, and or if you or Rob or TwoTonic Labs, look us up. And as I say, we'll create a Slack channel at some stage about StoryStream when I'm a little bit more deft to kind of open it up and let it out of the shop. It is a work in progress conceptually as well as implementation wise. We will let you know, and there's going to be a StoryStream Slack, and people can sort of exchange ideas and play around with modeling stuff, and I'll always be happy to answer questions in that. So with that, thank you very much for joining us for our event storing Ask Me Anything, and until next time, thank you.
And I'll follow up with a link to the recording. So, and thank you so much, and maybe with some other resources as well. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.